Good evening, and welcome to what is the 48th edition at the Chennai International Center. As you all know, the Chennai International Center was started 2 years ago to provide the city a platform for intellectual discussion and debate. We've had a number of great speakers at this podium. But the person we have this evening matches all of them. Dr. Arthur Brooke is president of the American Enterprise Institute, a Washington-based think tank. And he's been the president for the last 10 years, but about to demit office sometime next year. As I said, it's a public policy think tank dedicated, according to them, to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. AEI has a number of scholars, but they operate independently of any political party and have no institutional positions. What they say is their conclusions are fueled by rigorous data-driven research and broad-ranging evidence. They seek actively and encourage engagement with those who hold different points of view, and that's because they believe that a competition of ideas is essential to a free society. We have had our own share of debate in this country, sometimes civil, sometimes not so, but at least we do have this debate going. Dr. Brooke is a man of many parts, as I find. He started life as a musician, spent actually 12 years as a classical musician in the US and in Spain. Subsequently, he taught economics and social entrepreneurship at Syracuse University. And then now he is the president of the AEI. He is a contributing editor for the New York Times and the best-selling author of 11 books on topics including the role of government, fairness, economic opportunity, happiness, and morality of free enterprise. His latest book is about how to build a fairer, happier, and a more prosperous America. You know what Mr. Trump took as his slogan, "Make America Great Again." Maybe the next time around he should say, "Make America Happier Again." With him tonight is Mr. Sadanand Dhume, a colleague at AEI, and also he writes a column in the Wall Street Journal and in the Times of India here. The two of them will strike a conversation on the science of happiness, what one can do to build a life of happiness. May I now request Dr. Brooke to start off with a few words on the subject, and then he and Mr. Dhume will carry on the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. I'm delighted to be here in Chennai. This is the second time I've visited your city. The first time was 35 years ago, almost exactly 35 years ago in 1983, when I was 19 years old. And I came to Chennai by accident 35 years ago. I was on a flight from Colombo, Sri Lanka to Calcutta. And when we were mid-flight, the pilot came over the intercom and said, "We have to make an emergency landing. We're going to land in a city called Madras." And we landed here. And I spent 3 days with no telephone and no money exploring your city. And I have to say that coming back here this week, this is a dramatically different place than it was. I am impressed, I am amazed at the progress, the human progress that India has made over the past several decades. As an economist, there's no better example of human progress than this great country. And what a pleasure it is to come to this city and see it after 35 years prospering, where human dignity can be as high as they could possibly be. I'm impressed, and I think you should be congratulated to be part of that great project. I'm an economist, but I'm going to talk to you tonight about happiness, because happiness is what we all care about the most. Certainly that's what we all want. That's something I've been doing research on my entire career. I've written books on the subject of the economics of happiness. And tonight I want to talk about a part of happiness that most people have not written about very much, but which I'm doing research on right now. I'm going to be occupying myself for the next 2 years talking about happiness in the second half of life. Most of the time when you talk about happiness, you talk about how young people can build happy lives. And nobody ever talks about being happy when you're older. I guess if you're not happy by the time you're old, it's too late or something. I think that's not true. So I'm going to talk about the secret to being happy after the age of 50. The science of happiness in the second half of life. Now, not all of you are older than 50. I am. And how many of you are younger than 50? Okay? I hope you make it to 50. And if you do, remember what I say tonight. I want to start off by talking about why I'm interested in this. About 3 years ago, I had a kind of strange experience. It was right around the time of my 50th birthday. And I was on an airplane. I was feeling pretty good about life, I have to say. I had a new book that I felt good about, and I'm the president of my company. Life was good. But I was on this airplane. I'm on the airplane a lot. I travel a lot for my work. And I was coming from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. It was a flight all the way across the country. It was a 6-hour flight. And it was at night. It was dark. And people were sleeping or watching a movie. And I couldn't see anybody around me, but I heard a couple talking behind me in the row behind me. I wasn't trying to listen, but I couldn't help it. I was working on my laptop, and I could hear a wife talking to her husband. The husband, his voice, they sounded like they were old, maybe in their 70s or 80s. And the husband, I couldn't make out his words, but I could hear the wife. So I'd hear the husband, he would mumble and mumble. Then the wife would answer, "Oh, don't say that you have nothing to add anymore. You're not useless." Then I heard mumble, mumble, mumble. And then the wife said, "Don't say it would be better if you were dead." It's horrible. And I started getting into my mind a story of the gentleman who was talking. You know, he was disappointed about his life. His life hadn't gone, maybe he was frustrated. Maybe he wanted to do great things, but he was never able to. I had kind of had a story in my head about who he might be. We landed in Washington, D.C., and I was kind of eager to see what he looked like, because I had heard this window into his soul. All the lights went on, and we stood up, and I turned around, and it was one of the most famous men in America. For discretion, I can't tell you who it was. It was an astronaut. It was somebody we all knew, but somebody I've known about my entire life. A hero. Somebody with a great life. See, this is not what I was expecting. Somebody who has a great life, a national hero, should get old and feel proud of his achievements. But instead, I heard what he really thought, which was disappointment. We were walking out of the plane, and the pilot stopped him. He was right behind me. Stopped him and said, "Sir, you have been my hero since I was a little boy." And I turned around to look at him, and he was beaming with pride at that moment. And I thought to myself, which is the real hero, this one or 20 minutes ago? And I started the research I'm going to talk about tonight. See, I wanted to know what went wrong in his life and how we can avoid it. It's selfish, but I want to know the secret, and I want to share it with you. And I found the secret. I think I know the solution. And if you do the things that we talk about, we all can live a better life. And by the way, you can do this before you're 50. So let's start a little bit with the evidence on happiness. There's a lot of research on how happiness changes over the course of people's lives. Everybody thinks that happiness is individual, that happiness is particular, that it's personal, but the truth is that there are big patterns that we can follow over the course of people's lives. We find that on average, and by the way, a lot of the research comes from two British scholars. Their names are Andrew Oswald and David Blanchflower. They're both British, and they collect the best data in the world from countries all over the world. So the data I'm going to talk about, they come from India, they come from England, they come from the United States. They come from 500,000 people being followed over decades. The best data ever collected on happiness. And what do we find? That basically, people are a lot alike. As people age, they think they're going to be happier, but for the first few decades of adulthood, they get unhappier. So you find that happiness falls as you go through your 20s and 30s and 40s. And it gets to it, not a lot, just a little. And then when you're 50, it's at the lowest level, and then it starts to rise again. So one of the questions is always, why do people, they fall in their happiness in their 20s and 30s and 40s? And there are a lot of explanations for it. But the best explanation is what we call family difficulties. And what that means is teenage children, generally speaking. That's the real problem. And those of you who are my age, you know exactly what I'm talking about because you've had difficult teenage children. And then they grow up. And then they move away, and things start to get better. And so what you find is over people's 50s and 60s, in general, people get happier. You have 2 decades of getting happier, according to the data. But at 70, a funny thing happens. People break into 2 groups. Half get happier all the way until they die, and the other half start to get unhappier again. And this is true all over the world. It's true in my country, and it's true in your country, too. So here's the question. How can I be in the top half and not in the bottom half? That's the real research question. The astronaut was in the bottom half. I don't want that. I want to be in the top half. What can I do now to make sure I go in the right direction later? Because as you know, as we say, and as Christians say, as you reap, so shall you sow. You have to do the right things early so you can get good results late. If you study, you get a better job. If you save, you have more for retirement. And maybe you can make decisions earlier in your life and be happy later in your life. That's what I really want to understand. Now to begin with, who is on the lower branch of happiness when they're old? You'd think it would be people who haven't done good things, who haven't had nice careers, who haven't made a lot of money, right? That's wrong. It turns out that the unhappiest people, generally speaking, have been the most successful people earlier in their lives. This is something I don't want to learn. I don't want that. That's sad to me because we all want to be successful. Why are people disappointed? 2 psychologists at the University of Texas have looked at that, and they call that the burden of high achievement. The more you do earlier, the more disappointed you are when things don't go well later. In other words, what goes up has to come down, and it's disappointing not to be able to do things as well as you were before. That's what was happening to the person on the plane. Let me tell you another story that you will have heard about before, kind of a case study. Let me tell you the story of Charles Darwin. Everybody knows Charles Darwin, the most important scientist of the 19th century. Charles Darwin was born on February 12th, 1809, which is kind of an interesting and important date in American history. That was the same day that Abraham Lincoln was born, as a matter of fact. That's a date that we learn about in the history books and studying as kids in the United States. Charles Darwin became very famous early in life. Everybody knows that he discovered the theory of evolution. How did that happen? Well, when he was 22 years old, he got on a ship called the Beagle. and he traveled all over South America and to the Galapagos Islands. He was on this ship for 5 whole years, from when he was 22 until he was 27 years old. When he came back at the age of 27, he was discovering miraculous things about botany and about zoology, and he invented the theory of evolution over the next 30 years, just because of the specimens he collected and the data he collected. And he was the most famous scientist in all of Europe. He was arguably the most famous scientist in the world when he was a young man in his 20s and 30s and 40s. He was celebrated. He was rich. He was well known. He was, according to him, happy. And then something happened when Charles Darwin was 50 in the year 1859, which was that there was another scientist named Gregor Mendel. He was a Czech priest who invented something called genetics. Now, genetics required a lot of mathematics and a lot of statistics, and Charles Darwin didn't have the ability to do the mathematics and do the statistics. And so when Charles Darwin was 50, he was left behind by science completely and almost totally forgotten for decades until after his death. Now, how do you think that made Charles Darwin feel? The most famous scientist in the world was forgotten almost completely overnight. Here's what he said to one of his friends. Quote, "I have not the heart or strength to begin any investigation, which is the only thing which I enjoy." That's what Charles Darwin was writing. We don't know that about Darwin anymore. We think of Darwin as a great genius. So if this happens to people occasionally, what's the right thing to do? What's the right strategy in life to be happier, to have a life of achievement? I mean, look around this audience. You are successful people, successful in lots of industries, lots of walks of life, family life, academic life. How can you be successful and still enjoy it? Well, there are 3 strategies. Number 1, when you start to decline, fight it. Rage against it. There's a poet that most of you probably know. He's a Welsh poet named Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas's most famous poem is called "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night." Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. That might seem like a good strategy. He wrote that for his own father when his own father was starting to fail. It turns out that's a terrible strategy because, in fact, everything has to end. I've seen these wonderful career studies about how people's careers progress who are very important professionally. There's one scholar at Northwestern University who looks at scientists who have won the Nobel Prize in physics and chemistry and medicine, for example. On average, they do their work that wins the Nobel Prize at the age of 39. The likelihood of doing Nobel Prize winning work is the same at 20 as it is at 70, which is 0%. 0%. 39, and then it drops off. 39 is pretty young. You don't want to come down after 39, and yet that's what happens. Authors, they do their best writing when they're 51, and then it falls off. CEOs are most successful at 55, and then it drops off. Startup entrepreneurs, they do their best work at 31. That's depressing. At least it is to me. So the point is basically this. The more success you have, the more you notice it when it's gone. That's the problem. See, if you never do anything with your life, you can't tell the difference. There's no curve to go up that would come back down if you never do anything. The more you do, the farther you rise, the farther you fall. So raging against that, fighting against that, is an exercise in futility. It's a terrible idea. You can't fight it. Everybody has to experience it. And in the end, it's nothing more than an exercise in frustration. And that's exactly what the astronaut on the plane was doing wrong, was fighting against the inevitable decline that happens in life. That's the wrong strategy. So what's a better strategy? Oh, by the way, here's a lesson from that first strategy for all of us. Don't rage. Question, are you raging against something? Most of us are. Figure it out and stop. Second, here's a better strategy. I talked about the success curve where you get better and then you get worse. Better strategy is to find a new success curve in your life. How do you do this? I talked to you about Charles Darwin and Charles Darwin's decline and how frustrating and depressing it was for him. Now let me tell you about somebody else who did it better. And that's my favorite composer. I told you when I came here the first time I was a musician. I spent 12 years as a classical musician. My favorite musician was Johann Sebastian Bach, and still is. Maybe the greatest musician who's ever lived, greatest composer, at least Western composer. He lived from 1685 to 1750. He published more than 1,000 pieces of music. He was productive. By the way, he also had 20 children, which is productive. Bach was an innovator. He was known to be a musical entrepreneur in the High Baroque. The High Baroque was the period of music in which he wrote. He was the best innovator in the High Baroque. But something happened in the middle of his life. One of his sons, his most famous son was named Johann Christian Bach, invented a new kind of music that went beyond the Baroque. It was called the classical period in classical music, and it became all the rage across Europe. People stopped listening to Baroque music. Bach's son made Bach go out of style. And people stopped listening to his music almost completely, and almost overnight. One of the most famous composers in Europe became obscure because his own son got famous. So what did Bach do? Bach stopped being an innovator and started becoming a professor, became an instructor. He had a theory that the High Baroque was something that people needed to know forever, and he wanted to write down the best examples of it, even if people in his lifetime never listened to it. So he turned all of his attention to writing something called the Art of Fugue. In German, it's called die Kunst der Fuge, and is the masterwork of the High Baroque that nobody listened to in the second half of Bach's life, but that later we still listen to today as the best example of that kind of music ever written. Interesting fact, Bach became world famous 100 years after he died. Why? Because another composer named Felix Mendelssohn discovered his music, played it for his friends, and Bach became much more famous than he ever was during his lifetime 100 years after his death. In other words, he was right. He just never got to see it. I mean, he's in heaven, so he probably is looking at it now and enjoying it. He's pretty famous. Okay, so why do I bring that up? Because Bach went from innovator to instructor. And that's what everybody can do later in their life. Let me explain the science behind this. Early on in your life, when you have a lot of ideas and you have processing capacity, when you have creative ability, when you're able to reason things out faster than other people, that's something called fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the ability to recall things very, very quickly and to analyze facts with great speed. Young people have a lot of this. They have a lot of fluid intelligence. Here's the problem. Fluid intelligence starts to decline when you're about 40 years old, and it goes down very, very quickly. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. That's not the only kind of intelligence. There's another kind of intelligence called crystallized intelligence, also known as wisdom. Crystallized intelligence is how you use what you know. It's the ability to tell stories and put facts together in a coherent way. It's a different kind of intelligence. It's a different skill. That starts to increase in your 40s and your 50s and 60s, and it stays high through your 70s and 80s. Here's the point. Older people have more crystallized intelligence than younger people. The problem is that people get famous and successful in their lives with fluid intelligence, and they try to keep it forever. The innovation brain declines. The instructor brain comes later. So the secret is not to be like Darwin, it's to be like Bach, to be a teacher, to use crystallized intelligence. Now, that means something different for every single person. How are you going to be a teacher? What does that mean for your life? There's a scholar at the University of California who does work on different kinds of creative scholars. And one of the things he looks at is the difference between historians and poets. Now, poets use pure fluid intelligence. Historians use pure crystallized intelligence. To be a good historian, you need to know a lot of facts, and that takes many years, and then be able to combine them effectively later in life. That's the point of the history profession. Why does this scholar do this work? Because he wants to see how old you are when half your work is done. It turns out that, on average, poets have written half their poetry by the age of 40. Historians have written half of their work when they're 65. 65 years old, and half of your work is still set to go. Imagine this. That is the most encouraging thing I've ever heard. Besides, the best half in quality happens after 65 for historians. So you notice that the greatest historians in India and in England and the United States, they're always old people. That's the reason. You say, wow, he keeps going year after year. The truth is, you can't be a good historian when you're 30. The other interesting fact is that at universities in the United States, we always keep a lot of data on the quality of professors. One of the big problems that we have is that we always ask, I'm a professor, so this is a problem from my point of view. We always ask students to rate their professors, right? Everything is about consumer feedback in America, right? Even universities. How good is your professor? We have data on this, and we find that the consumer feedback about professors are best, on average, when professors are 75 years old. When I was a professor at Syracuse University, really young, I see these data, and really young people, 30 years old, would come out of their PhDs, their doctorates, and they would say, what's the secret to being a great professor? And the answer is, wait 30 years. Why? Because young people have high fluid intelligence and low crystallized intelligence. Old people have high crystallized intelligence and low fluid intelligence. Don't try to rely on what you once had. Cultivate what your absolute strength is going to be going forward. How can you be a teacher? Lesson number two. Early on, be an innovator. Later, be a teacher. So if you're after 50, you have to ask yourself, what am I doing today to share my wisdom more effectively with others? Lesson 3. Stop adding to your life and start subtracting. We have an expression in the United States called the bucket list. Anybody know what that is? A bucket list. It's all the things you want to do. It's a list of things that you want to do before you die. Like, I want to fly a plane. I want to go skiing in Colorado. All the things on the bucket list. It's an idiotic thing. Why? Because all it does is complicate your life. The truth of the matter is, if you want to be happier as you get older, take things out of your bucket and throw them away. The happiest people later in life have the simplest lives. Let me tell you how I understand this. For a long time, I was traveling a lot to Taiwan. I was working a lot with the president of Taiwan. And people always told me that if you go to Taiwan, there's actually not very much to see in Taiwan. There's a very tall building called the Taipei 101. And the only real thing to see in Taiwan is the National Palace Museum, which is the greatest repository of Chinese artifacts in the world. When the Chinese nationalists were jumping across the Taiwan Straits being chased by the communists in the 40s, they were taking all of the art and artifacts of history with them. And they took them to Taiwan and opened this National Palace Museum of all the greatest Chinese art from centuries, from millennia. It takes days to see everything in this museum. So I've seen it, and it's impressive, and it's beautiful. But I had one question I always wanted to ask, which is, what is the philosophical difference between Eastern art and Western art? When I come to India or China or Thailand, when I'm in one of these countries and I see art, what's philosophically the difference between the art that I see between here and Europe and the United States? So one day at the National Palace Museum, I hired an art historian to take me, somebody who was very philosophically sophisticated. to take me through the National Palace Museum and explain the philosophical difference. He said, actually, it's simple. I said, well, so what's the difference? And he said, tell me. He asked me a question. Because in China, they always answer your question with a question. He said, when you think of a piece of art that has not been started, what do you think of? An art that has not been started yet. And I said, an empty canvas. He said, correct. When we think of a piece of art that has not been started, we think of a block of stone. He said, why? He said, because you think that art is filling something up. We think of actual art as finding something that's already there by chipping away all the parts that aren't the art. Now think about it. They say that in China they'll say, how do you make a horse and rider out of a piece of marble? And the answer is simple. Just take away all the parts of the marble that don't look like a horse and don't look like a rider. Of course, it's not that easy, right? But conceptually, it's really simple. Now, why is this important? Because this is not just about the philosophy of art. This is about the philosophy of life. In the West, one of the things we do really well is adding complication, is making things thicker and richer and more complicated than they were. This is true about everything. And by the way, in art, I'm a musician, not a visual artist. This is true in the musical arts between the East and the West as well. When we think of an enormous masterwork of art, of musical art, we think of a symphony orchestra with 85 musicians playing simultaneously. I was once at a concert with a Chinese friend who said, I can't hear the music because too many people are playing. Now, if you notice, Chinese classical music, or for that matter, Carnatic music, or North Indian Hindustani classical music, is simple compared to Brahms and Beethoven. Why? Because the whole idea is taking away all of the sound until you find the actual piece of music. That's the philosophical difference between, even in music, it's the same set of ideas, and it's the same philosophical idea when you think about life, particularly in the first half or the second half of life. In the first half of your life, if you want to be successful, you add things: money, possessions, relationships, experiences. You add things to your life. But if you want to be successful in the second half of your life, you're not going to be happier by adding more things. I know a lot of wealthy people. In my line of work, I work with people in high finance in New York City. They have all the money in the world. And sometimes they'll say, basically, I know I'll be really happy if I finally get a new boat. No, you won't. That's basically like taking a painting that's already full of paint and putting another brush stroke on it. It won't look better. It won't be a better work of art. There's already too much paint on the canvas. You need to start thinking about your life like a block of jade to trying to find the image within. That's how we need to start thinking about our lives in the second half. Now, that was on my mind last February when I was in southern India. Sadanand Dhume, my colleague, and I, we were in Kerala. And we were looking for a teacher that we had heard about, a very wise teacher of Vedic scripture. His name is Sri Nonchur Venkataraman. He's well known. He was a disciple of Sri Ramana Maharshi. He is well known for teaching people. Now, he doesn't spend any time in the West, but I'd heard about him and I wanted to meet him. And so we found him about 4 hours outside of Kochi, and I had a very specific question about something I was writing about this subject, which is I wanted to understand Vanaprastha. I wanted to understand the ashramas, but I wanted to spend the third ashrama, right? Why? Because I'm finishing Grihastha. Vanaprastha starts about now. And I want to be a sannyasi when I'm 75 years old. I want that. And I know perfectly that I can't go from Grihastha to be a sannyasi. I have to pass through Vanaprastha, and I have to do something. And I don't know what, because I'm not from here. So I found the teacher and asked him the question. And he told me the same thing as the guide in the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. Take away all the parts of you that aren't you. The point of vanaprastha, if I understand correctly, and I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, some of you are, so I say this with humility and affection. Van is to retire. Vanaprastha means to retire into the forest. So van is, and prastha is retiring into. This idea, I mean, it's incredible metaphor. What does this mean? Go someplace that's quiet, have less noise, do less of the things that distract you. That's the point, my friends, of the next 25 years of my life, is to stop distracting myself with the things that are not me. This is really important, isn't it? Because this is the next lesson, is to experience who you are. Now, I'm going to give you one more image of this because, and I'm going to go back to China here for a second. There is a place in western China called the Yungang Grottos. It's 7-story Buddhas that are cut into a mountainside. They were finished in the year 453. After 50 years, 40,000 stone-cutting artisans working for 5 decades to cut these Buddhas into the side of a mountain. They're incredible. 7 stories high. You've never seen anything like this. Now, why is that an important image? Because it took centuries, millennia, millions of years to build up these mountains. But if you want to find the Buddhas, you don't add more stone. You take away stone. You have the Buddha in you. You have to take away the part of you that's obscuring the Buddha. That's one way for you to remember this with a visual metaphor. Lesson number 3. Early on, add. Get your education, get married, have kids, work hard, earn money, save money. I'm talking to all of you who raised your hands when I said you're under 50. All the rest of us, take things away. Ask yourself this year, what am I going to take away this year? What I'm going to ask you to do, your homework, because I'm a professor, is I want you to make a list tonight of the things you're going to take away from your lives this year. And you know you're going to be happier because you're going to find the Buddha within if you do. Now, I promised you 3 lessons, and I gave you 3 lessons, but I have one more before I finish, before we go to a conversation. Because I've been talking in a very, very American way, as if you can do all this by yourself. We're very individualistic in the United States. Everything is about my success and me and my life, right? And the truth is, the last lesson is you can't do this by yourself. You can't do this alone. This is not just your journey. See, when we think about success in life, we tend to think of it in a solitary way. I'm a Christian, and in my Christian faith, we often recite the psalm from the first psalm, the 3rd verse, to talk about a righteous man. He is like a tree whose leaf does not wither and who prospers in all that he does. What's a tree? It's a solitary, beautiful, strong thing, and you think of yourself as building up your life like a tree. But here's the reason that's the wrong metaphor for a successful life and for a happy life. When I was thinking about this, I was in a place in Colorado called Aspen, Colorado. It's kind of a famous place. It's named after a kind of a tree called an aspen tree. It's a stately, large tree with white bark, and it's beautiful. And I learned that the aspen tree is actually not a tree. It's not an individual plant at all. It turns out that aspen trees are just one plant, connected by one set of roots. And what looks like one tree isn't. It's simply one part of the same tree. The world's largest living organism is the aspen tree. It's hundreds of acres and millions of kilograms of wood, all in one plant. Here's the point. It's funny, I was in Dharamsala earlier this week. I was with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I had the opportunity to take a couple of classes to study a little bit with some of his monks. And one of the questions that I was asking was, I'm a Westerner, help me, explain emptiness. Explain the concept. It's hard for me. And one of the explanations I got for emptiness was actually interdependence. If you want to understand that one individual doesn't exist, you have to understand that you only exist interdependent with other individuals. That's one way of understanding emptiness. That's the same thing as the aspen tree. That's the same thing as you. If you want to see your true self, look to your right and look to your left. That's you too. Now, why is this important when we talk about success? Because when I'm in decline, I'm simply one shoot coming out of the same root system. My kids are rising. You're rising. The world is rising. God is raising up somebody else, and I am part of that person as well. Don't understand yourself as a single individual. On the contrary, you're part of a community. You're part of a beautiful community that's interdependent. So here, my friends, now are 4 lessons before I finish. Don't rage against change because you'll miss opportunities, and change is good. Lesson number 2, become a teacher the older you get, and you will be victorious. Lesson number 3, don't add things as you get older. Take things away to find your true self. And lesson number 4 is surround yourself with other people. Surround yourself with human love. If we do these 4 things, I am convinced that all of us can be prepared to have a happy life. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Arthur, and thank you all of you for coming here this evening. As you'll soon discover, I'm quite out of my depth discussing these issues. I read about the political economy of India and who's up and down in the horse race of politics. But I've had the benefit of listening to Arthur speak about these things and of traveling with him over the years to various places and meeting with extremely interesting people. And I remember a few years ago, you gave a talk that was on a similar topic, and I think we were in Delhi. And in that talk, you spoke about the 4 things, and that was faith, family, friends, and work, if I remember correctly. Could you sort of explain to this audience how that works and how that fits with your 4 layers?
So, I think actually mine isn't on. Mine on now? Can you hear me now? Thank you. There's been a lot of research on why some people are happy and some people aren't. I've talked about it a little bit tonight, but let's go through the quick course. I mean, this would probably be a whole course at the university, but I won't do that to you. Half of human happiness is genetic. So you get it from your parents. About 40% of happiness is circumstantial. What's going on in your life. 10% of your happiness is really under your control. And it comes from investing in 4 things every day. Your faith, or your spirituality, your family, your friendships, and your work. Those are the big 4. Unfortunately, most people are not investing in those things sufficiently. This has been very important for me to see the data and do the research on this. It has changed my life a lot. Because every day I do an inventory before I go to sleep, and I say, did I put a deposit in each one of these accounts today? It's very easy for somebody like me to only put a deposit in the work account and to neglect everything else. But now I think that I say my prayers, that I spend time with my family, that I call my friends, and that I do my work. And that's really helped me a lot. The other thing that's worth keeping in mind is that there are 4 things that people think. So those are the 4 things that bring you happiness. There are 4 things that people think will bring happiness and they don't. And those 4 things are money, pleasure, power, and fame. Those things bring no happiness beyond basically, simply beyond poverty. So obviously being really poor is difficult for happiness. But beyond the level of poverty, money doesn't do it, physical pleasure doesn't do it, power doesn't do it, and fame don't do it. So don't look for the idols of money, power, pleasure, and fame. Look for and put deposits in the account of faith, family, friendships, and work. And that's the secret to having the best investment portfolio of happiness in your life.
Bringing it back to this idea of the stages, you said something which I found very striking, where you said that I want to be a sannyasi. Now, and then hence you go through vanaprastha because that's where you want to get. Do you think this is something? Is there, first of all, on a personal note, why do you want to be a sannyasi? And secondly, is this a universal longing, or is this a particular thing?
It's a good question. I don't know if it's a universal longing, but I feel that my ultimate destiny, beyond even human happiness, is to be close to God. I believe that's why I was put on earth, is to understand my relationship to God and become close to God. That's my own personal belief. Not everybody agrees with me. Not everybody shares my religious beliefs. One of the reasons I love coming to India is because I can go to a public audience and say this, and you don't laugh. In America, in a university, I would go to a university and say this, and people would think, oh, that's ridiculous. Oh, that's primitive thinking. One of the things I love about this country is there's a respect for spirituality here that you don't see in most places. I congratulate you on that, and I hope very much that that persists forever in this country. Now, the reason, therefore, that I want to be a sannyasi is I believe that that is my spiritual destiny, but I know I have to do the work, which is the reason that I'm interested in making sure that I do vanaprastha correctly, and I look for the best teacher that I could possibly find. And by the way, I'm still working on that, and any of you who have recommendations or advice for me, I will gratefully take it.
Coming back to AEI, and you've been president of AEI for 10 years, incredibly successful president, grown the institution enormously, and then recently you said that you were going to step down, really at the top of your game. Could you sort of talk a little bit about the philosophy and the thinking that drove you to that?
So, the American Enterprise Institute is an institution that's been around for 80 years. So I'm obviously not the first president of the institution. I'm the 11th president. I promised when I took over 10 years ago that I would be president for 10 years, and not longer than that. Now, nobody believed me, because most people don't step down from a leadership job after 10 years, but it's usually the right thing to do. And part of the reason for this is because you can clear the way for somebody else to have success. So you can do a good job for 10 years and then step back and do something else. Personally, I'm going back to academia. I'm going to be a professor at Harvard University starting next summer, which is a good opportunity to work on many of the questions that we're talking about here. But most importantly, I've seen a lot of evidence that suggests that when you're the chief executive for more than 10 years, it doesn't go very well. It's not good for you, and it's not good for, I think I'm doing it as a matter of self-protection. I think I'm actually, and there's an old, if you've seen these old Western movies, and people say, I'm going to get out of town before the sheriff shows up, that's a little how I feel.
Coming back to this idea of starting to subtract from life in your second, and the way you put it, it was, you make it sound easy, but it's of course something that is enormously difficult. So what, if you had to sort of come up with advice on, like, okay, I know, I believe you. It's certainly not going to be easy for me. It's certainly not going to be easy for many of the people in this room who are in their 30s and 40s. How? What's the how? We know the what.
It's a good question, and I'm wrestling with that myself. I mean, it's one thing. I'm not suggesting that you become a renunciant, a mendicant, that you sit begging on the side of the road. I'm not recommending that. I mean, if you want to, most of you don't, and neither do I. But the key thing is that we all know the parts of us that are not adding and that really are taking away our focus on the things that matter the most. That's really key, and it's asking ourselves, would I really be maybe happier if I didn't have this relationship? If I didn't have to do these particular things? I mean, in some cases, it's actually kind of convenient. Perhaps you're asking, would I be happier if I didn't go spend a week with my mother-in-law? Yeah, you would, probably, as a matter of fact. So maybe that's a bad example. I'm sorry. I don't mean to create, I'm not trying to create problems in your marriage. But there are key things that people are doing that actually, on reflection, really aren't adding to your life. Will it be hard? Yeah, but one of the things that I've found is it gets easier with practice. Taking things away gets easier with each additional thing that you take away. Whether it's one of the greatest feelings, by the way, is getting rid of possessions and simplifying your life and owning fewer things. That turns out to be really a wonderful feeling, and it's hard to do at first, but then you get better at it and you do more of it. So it's a question of practice and courage.
So this takes me to something that there was a very interesting question that someone raised this morning. Someone who's a businessman, and we're in a country which, as you said, has changed very dramatically from when you were here in 1983. And the key date in that journey is 1991, when India begins to open up its economy, it embraces economic reforms, and the poverty rate starts dropping dramatically. There's still too many rules, but it's easier to do business. There's much more prosperity. And someone asked you this question, I think it would be good to share it with everyone else, excuse me, where he said that at a personal level, this is a successful businessman, he wants to start subtracting. But he worries that the personal quest to subtract will hurt society because he still wants to be adding for other people. How do you reconcile that?
There's a very interesting attitude that people have in a lot of societies, in the West and in the East as well, that capitalism, which is everybody knows is productive. Everybody knows that the world is full of things because of capitalism. But that capitalism is good for rich people and bad for poor people. That's exactly wrong. Capitalism is the best thing that ever happened to poor people around the world. Literally, the reason that 2 billion of our brothers and sisters have been pulled out of poverty since I was a child was particularly because China and India became more capitalistic. It's a great thing. It's not perfect. We need more than that. We need spirituality. We need rules. We need morality. We need regulation. It can't be just capitalism, but it's a wonderful thing. It's a humanitarian miracle, as a matter of fact. It's the greatest thing for the poor. The problem is it's dangerous for the rich because materialism distracts us from the most important things. This is the big thing that we misunderstand, is the danger that greed and materialism introduces into our lives. So the question is, how can each of us continue to be productive, continue to be part of an economy that lifts people out of poverty and at the same time not to be attached? The goal is abundance without attachment. It's a big responsibility for all of us that are so lucky. I look around, everybody in this room has some degree of material abundance. Some of you a lot, some of you less, but all of us are the lucky ones in our society. But with that great fortune brings tremendous responsibility. It's very important, and again, it's easier if you don't have the responsibility, but we do have it. How can you bring abundance to everybody without having material attachment that ruins your life? And I leave that up to you, because that's wisdom that I'm trying to gain myself, and I'll gladly take your prayers and advice.
Is there in a society like this, which has, I think many people instinctively understand the urge toward renunciation. But what you find historically is that many people who have, the political sphere, people who have understood that and codified that in their own life, take somebody like Gandhi. These are also people who have been very, very suspicious of wealth generation, entrepreneurship, of those. How do you sort of, so you in a way, when you're in the US, you are with an audience that kind of doesn't understand the second half of life argument, gets the first half of life argument instinctively. I would argue that over here, you're with people who get the second life argument instinctively. The convincing, maybe we may need more convincing on the first half side.
It's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful question, and it's true. I'm not sure. I know the answer to this question, but I think that the idea that one of the things to understand about the United States, that most of you do, because a lot of you have spent time in the United States, is that we're very lucky in not having the same level of social distinctions and control, because it's a country entirely of immigrants. It's a country where everybody started poor. Everybody's family in the whole country started poor. Nobody came to the United States rich. And so the result is that there's a kind of natural equality, and there's a natural sense that people can rise in the United States. Most other countries don't see that. I've lived a lot in Europe, and there's social strata, there's hierarchy. People feel that if somebody's rich, it's because their parents were rich and their grandparents were rich, and there's nothing that they can do to get ahead of a social system like that. That's a problem in Europe. It's a problem in most countries besides the United States. And so I say that I think that the challenges are different in different places, but the opportunity is to find ways to create more opportunity for people at the bottom. And the more that we can do that, the more that people are not going to be suspicious about capitalism. People are suspicious about capitalism when it looks like it's fixed for the rich, when it looks like people who are not rich can't participate in the system. That's the really dangerous thing, I think. And so to the extent that all of us who are pretty lucky can push opportunity to the margins of society, can find better education and better opportunity, and help people to lift people up who are at the periphery and who are poor, I think that we'll all be much better off, and there will be less suspicion about the system in general.
Which brings us to another point that you've raised, which is about Adam Smith and the importance of morality, which we find in many of our economic discussions. If you look at the pink papers in India, the Economic Times, the Financial Express, the discussion about economics and the discussion about prosperity tends to be driven by the numbers, per capita income, and I'm guilty of that myself. And you've made the point that actually the system only works when there is morality undergirding it. If you could just explain that, because this country has gone through a whole bunch of corruption scandals. The last 7 to 8 years have been tumultuous.
Yeah.
And society in many ways is grappling with this idea where wealth is rising, but along with wealth, corruption has been rising too. So how do you view this?
So the great Adam Smith, the great writer about economics, in 1776 he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. That wasn't his most important book. 17 years earlier, he wrote about morality. 17 years earlier, about moral virtue. And he believed that that's important because morals have to come before markets. That's the most important idea from Adam Smith. So he's known for being the father of capitalism. He was actually the father of morality that has to precede capitalism. This is really important. When in the Western Hemisphere, you have the successful capitalistic economies, Canada and the United States, and then you have the unsuccessful capitalist economies, which is most of South America. Relatively successful periodically. But the main reason that a place like Argentina has been in downward mobility for 100 years is not because of too much capitalism, but rather because of too much corruption, because of not enough morality. It's good to have markets, but markets don't work when people don't behave in a moral way. When I go to South America, I'm amazed. It's all the same powerful families that control everything. And people at the margins can't control anything. That's actually not the way capitalism is supposed to work. Capitalism is supposed to have equal opportunity. And so that's the reason we need universal education. That's the reason that we need welfare systems that lift people up. And that's exactly what they don't have in places like Argentina, and why capitalism is sort of doomed in a place like Argentina. So if you believe in free enterprise, if you believe that the free enterprise system is a great humanitarian achievement, you also must believe in the idea of lifting people up in opportunity and fighting corruption, and fighting as vigorously as possible entrenched privilege. Entrenched privilege is the enemy of opportunity, and as such is the enemy of development in a free enterprise system.
But when you speak about equality, it's very different from when an Indian politician, for instance, speaks about equality. How do you understand equality?
I don't think about equality of outcomes or equality of incomes. I think about equality of opportunity. Now, we're all born differently. Some people are born with certain abilities and other people are born with others. Some people are born to families that have more resources and some people to less. But we can equalize opportunity a lot more than we do. The reason that this country and my country have universal education systems is because we want more equal opportunity. The reason that we require families to send their kids to school is because we want more equal opportunity. The way that the single best way that we can lift up countries around the world is by equalizing education between boys and girls. Girls' education is the single best way to get a more prosperous country in countries all around the world because of opportunity. I don't care about equal incomes. I care about equal opportunity. That's what I feel is really the moral challenge of our time, and that's a different way of thinking about it than we typically hear from politicians. When they say equality, they talk about equality of wealth or equality of income, and I think that that's ultimately mostly a misguided idea.
So I'm going to open this up to questions. I have a couple of requests. The first is, please make it a question and not a lecture. Should be a question mark at the end. Keep it short, and if you can just identify yourself to start with, that would be wonderful. Why don't you, gentlemen in the front row?
I am Dr. Johann. I am a cardiologist. I want to ask you, if everyone follows from today what you have been telling, Johann will become jobless.
Who would become jobless?
He, because he's a cardiologist.
I want to see the day that no one should get any heart trouble. I really appreciate both of you the conversation. Suppose a couple, very rich multimillionaires, really happened to me as a patient. Got only one son, 24-year-old son. He has been traveling in Benz to the engineering college for higher studies, here nearby. He died because of accident on the road once.
Your son?
No, my patient.
Or your patient, right?
Couple, only one son.
I
He
see.
died.
Right.
So I want to make him feel happy.
How can we make him a happier person?
Yes. But the situation really happened. Because of that, mother had an infarction, father had a stroke. I have been really great difficult to tackle them. We are going to go in there.
Yeah. How do you, in other words, what advice can you give to people who suffered great tragedy
Right.
in their lives? This is a hard question, and if anybody here is a psychiatrist, I'll gratefully take your advice on this. But one of the things that we have found is that, again, the sources of happiness, the four sources of happiness are faith, family, friends, and work. The first three of those are the greatest consolation when there's tragedy in people's lives. What do people turn to when something is terrible in their lives? They turn to their faith in God. This is what people ask for consolation from God. Why? Because God is a great consoler. They turn to the families that they have left, and they turn to their friends. That's the reason, my friends, why you have to put a deposit into these accounts every day, because at some point you're going to want to take a withdrawal from these accounts. And the day that tragedy befalls you, which it will, that's the day when you want to have a lot in those accounts so that you can take a withdrawal. So the best I can do is to suggest that those are the sources of the consolation that I would always recommend. Thank you for that.
Gentleman in the
beautiful
second
question.
row.
Sir, you said...
If you could identify yourself, please.
my name is Ramakrishnan. I was a scientist in Baba Atomic Research Center. Sir, you said that Adam Smith wrote about morality 17 years before the Wealth of Nations. The point is, it is easy to teach a skill, but it is very difficult to make a different type of character. Only because of this difficulty, the world has become rich, but it has not yet become moral.
So here's, I suppose the question is not how can we become richer, but how can we become more moral? This is the challenge for all of us who are in a position this is a challenge for all of us who are over 50 to teach the people who are under 50. We shouldn't just teach about how to be more productive. We shouldn't just teach about how to be more productive. We have to teach people how to be happier and more moral. This is advice that we need to be talking about more openly and more freely with other people, because ultimately that's the great favor that we can do to other people, is sharing the wisdom that we have about greater morality, which ultimately leads to greater happiness.
Gentleman with the black shirt back there.
My name is Venkatesh. I'm an entrepreneur, software entrepreneur.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about the World Happiness Report, quantitative measures of happiness. And you see Scandinavian countries, socialist economies, you see what goes into making that index, right? And you start with per capita income, then you have societal support, life expectancy, then generosity and trust. I find Scandinavia ranks right among the top. United States is 15 to 20 somewhere, and India and other countries, Eastern countries, are fairly way below, right? Do you resonate with that judgment? My experience personally has not been like, something that goes with that ranking. What do you think about it?
Thank you for that beautiful question. I appreciate that a lot, and I'm impressed by your knowledge of the World Happiness Ranking, these surveys. So what he's referring to is that when we rank happiness around the world, we do surveys and we ask people basically how happy they are, and then we take everybody's answers at face value, and we assume that every country answers the question in the same way, and then we see who's happiest. Now that's a big problem. For example, in the Germanic-speaking countries, all of the words for happiness derive from the word for luck. In the Romantic languages, the word for happiness all comes from felicitousness. These are different concepts, and so consequently, happiness means something different in different languages. We also find that there are some cultures in which, for example, in Russia, you would never say you're happy because it brings bad luck. So when you're asked this in a survey, you say, I'm not happy. I'm not happy. Because you don't want to be unhappy under the circumstances. Okay, there's one more layer added to this. I have a movie coming out, a documentary film about this subject coming out in the next few months. We'll make sure that it's marketed adequately in India if you want to see it. The movie starts out in a place in Mumbai called Dharavi. Dharavi was one of the most famous slums in the world. It's one of the world's largest slums. It's certainly one of the largest slums in Asia. Dharavi has 1 million people it's an incredible concentration. So it's basically the equivalent of 400 people living in my house in Washington, D.C. It's incredible when you go there. It must be terrible. It's not terrible. I mean, it's poor, but it's mobile. I mean, there's 10,000 small enterprises. Virtually all the children go to school. It's improving. I've gone to Dharavi several times over the years, and every time you go, Dharavi's better. That's where the film starts. And you say, for an American audience, I know you think this is sad. I know you think this is awful. It's not awful in the way that you thought it was, because it's doing this. Then we go to Scandinavia. Then we go to Denmark. The happiest place in the world according to these indices. I'm not so sure, actually. When I talk to the Danish, they like it, but it's a country of 5 million people. There are practically 5 million people living in Dharavi. It's a boutique society in Denmark. They're kind of all alike, and you're free to be Danish. When I come to India, there are 17 alphabets on your currency. I mean, this is the most diverse place I've ever been in my whole life. Under Danish circumstances, it would be impossible to be happy, defined like a Dane. Danes are all alike. They all want the same thing. They all look alike. It's the most amazing thing you've ever seen. And so therefore, if you're a little strange, or you're a little different, or you want to have 8 kids, or you want to work really hard and get rich, or if you're super religious, you will fail in Denmark because you're not like everybody else. And you can succeed in the United States if you're strange, and you can succeed in India if you're strange. That's the good thing about being in a diverse society. So the long and short of it is I don't trust those indices at all. And if I had a choice between living in Copenhagen and living in Chennai, I would take Chennai every day of the week.
I want a question. Are there any women? I want the lady over there.
Hi, my name is Mridula. I help run a company and I'm a writer. So my question is this. You talked about morality coming before markets. I'm going to make a quick statement and then the question's coming. Morality happens when you have repeated, there's a greater chance of morality happening if you have repeated interactions. So the question is this. With social media, especially Twitter, where you have anonymity and you have a very short attention span, how does social media in general and Twitter in particular affect morality coming before markets or morality happening at all?
Well, that's a great question. It's a great question. And there's a lot of social experimentation on social media right now. And the results are very clear. Social media makes people miserable and terrible. Social media is basically bad. one of the things is we have experiments on happiness experiments about social media. And what you find is that every hour you spend on social media, you become less happy. Why is this? Because you're interacting with people in not a human way. Interactions between people require interactions between humans, generally speaking. Now, one of the things that we find is a human conversation between two people in person. You and I are talking right now. That makes us happier than if we were talking on the phone. And talking on the phone makes you happier than if you're talking over social media. And when more and more of your life is spent on social media in small bites with people you don't know, especially when you're anonymous, you're exactly right. That actually crowds out morality. It crowds out happiness. It crowds out humanity in very important ways. So what do we do about it? It's interesting, I've talked about this, I've written about this a lot, and I talked to a very famous psychologist in the United States about this. And what he does is he's very famous for bringing couples together who are about to get divorced. And when couples are about to get divorced, they don't know how to communicate with each other very well. So when you first fall in love, you can't think of anything to criticize about each other. But when you're about to get divorced, you can't think of anything except criticisms. So what does he do? He makes them make lists. These couples have to carry around a notebook, and they can't criticize each other until they've said 5 nice things about each other. Literally. In other words, you have to say, I want to tell you I'm mad at you, but first time I have to say, that was a delicious dinner you cooked for me, and I think you'll look really pretty tonight, and you have to say 5 things, and he finds that when they do that, the couples come back together just because of this formula. So I asked him about this, and he said, if you want to use social media and you want to make people better off and you want more morality and more happiness, you have to write 5 beautiful, nice things on social media for everything you write that's negative. And if you follow this formula, it could actually help change the world. And it would really start with you and me doing that. So I've actually written this, and I'm following this, and my life is getting better.
But Arthur, if I follow this, I'll go out of business as a columnist. 5 nice things about the government before they say what?
That's right. So you have to say 5 nice things about the Modi administration. Right. That's your problem.
Just a really quick follow-on question. But the model of capitalism today is more and more in every market, winner take all.
Well, the point is it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, it doesn't have to be winner take all. Excellence is rewarded in capitalism, but once again, remember that capitalism is in the hands, we don't need less capitalism, we need better capitalists. We need more moral training, we need more spirituality. I mean, if you're a capitalist in a market and you care about other people, you're simply not going to put up with corruption. You're not going to put up with cheating other people. You're not going to cut corners because that's the wrong thing to do. And in societies where there is more trust, you have fewer of these problems. One of the reasons that we have a lot less corruption in the United States than in Argentina is not because of laws and not because of government, but because we have a lot more social trust in the United States than they do in Argentina. Very low levels of trust in Argentina. Even lower levels of trust in Russia. So one of the things that we need is to raise the level of morality and spirituality among people, and we can solve a lot of these problems. Capitalism doesn't have to kill us, I think.
I am. Gentleman over here in the fourth row.
My name is M. Kalyanasundaram. I'm a researcher. You mentioned faith, family, community, and work as 4 areas. So my question relates to the faith aspect of it. I'd like to understand your view on the notion of mutual respect between different faiths, going beyond just tolerance as a metric. That's one. And my question to Sadanand would be, if I could, I think you were quoted in Huffington Post on July 17, 2017, where it said that this nonsensical notion of breaking India forces, which I am sure you've seen on Twitter and elsewhere, is kind of rubbish. Now, I have this book which is 650 pages with 60 pages of bibliography and 75 pages of notes. I'd like to understand your view on whether you actually read this book and whether your comment was related to this. Thank you.
Thank you.
You want to start?
You go first.
Oh. What was my question? I don't remember.
Faith part.
Oh yeah, faith part.
Beyond tolerance to mutual.
No. There's a really good point. I mean, you talk about faiths being tolerant of each other. That's a terrible standard. You know, it's funny, we talk about the need for civility and tolerance in our societies. Those are the worst standards possible when you think about it. I mean, if I told you, if you asked me, how's your marriage, and I say my wife and I are civil to each other, you'd say, well, you got a lot of problems, right? That's a terrible standard. Why? You know, in the Bible, in my religion, we say in the Gospel of Matthew, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. What's the standard? If you really do love God, what's the standard? Loving everybody. We need to love each other, including if we don't share the same faith. That's the standard to which we have to live. That's the standard that we have to teach, and that's the standard we have to hold each other to. So if you and I believe these things, we have to fraternally hold each other to that standard. If you see me simply being tolerant and civil, saying something that simply tolerates Islam, something that simply tolerates Buddhism, you have to say, not good enough. Not good enough. You have to hold me to a standard of love, and I have to hold you to a standard of love. Now the harder question for Sadanand Dhume.
So listen, this is really not, we can talk separately, but I guess, you know, that quote that you're talking about, it's with reference to an idea, that's the book that you're holding, it's with reference to this idea that the West, the United States and the West in general, is part of some dark project to essentially dismember India. That's what breaking India is. And I believe that actually it's exactly the opposite. We are at a moment in time where the US in particular is a tremendous well-wisher of India. The US has decided for its own reasons that a strong, successful, prosperous, democratic India is good for Asia, it's good for the world, it's good for the United States. So when people start going down these dark alleyways and making claims that the United States in fact or seeks the opposite, I'm afraid that I have to say that does not square with what I think is reality. I'm happy to have a separate conversation with you, but this evening is really not about that.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sumant Raman. I'm a doctor and a television anchor. I have just two very, very short questions. First, from a government perspective, from a state, how do you create a more moral society? I mean, if you were to list the top 2 or 3 things that a state can do to create, because one of the issues we face is a crisis of morality in India. The second one is some of the state governments have started creating ministries of happiness, for happiness. Yeah. They've got now ministers for happiness and so on. I mean, do you think that that's a good idea, or do you think that some kind of state intervention can make people happier, more than, the state just doing the job that they're supposed to do properly?
That's a wonderful question. I appreciate it. The government cannot make people happy. The government can take away the many sources of unhappiness. That's what governments can do. So, for example, universal education, welfare systems where people are not dying of preventable diseases, trying to stop hunger. These take away the sources of unhappiness, but they don't bring happiness. I don't want the government to be in the business of faith or family or friendship, and I don't want the government to be in the market for work either. I want those things to be conducted through the free enterprise system and on the basis of private morality. And that means basically that we all have a huge responsibility as citizens in free societies, in the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy. By the way, to add on to what Sadanand says, I think that the most important bilateral relationship in the world over the next 3 decades will be the United States and India. I think that we are the competitive idea to what's going on in much of the world, and we have to set an example for this. But this requires that we have, as citizens, that we take the responsibility of citizens and to not take the moral responsibility and to put it onto the government. It's hard to be a citizen in a democracy. It requires lots of work because it requires that we say it's not the government's business to be part of religion. It's not the government's business to tell me how to raise my family. It's not the government's business to give me a job. That's the business of what we do as individual citizens, and it requires more work than what they have in centrally planned economies. But it also can yield the greatest benefit, as we're seeing in the incredible progress in India and the real progress, the model that the United States has created for the rest of the world. We have to do this together.
Lady over there.
I'm Priya. I'm a preventive cardiologist with a PhD in genetics, unfortunately. So I'm going to quote
Unfortunately, that's amazing. That's phenomenal.
Because I'm going to quote you on, you said about 50% of our happiness is gene-based, about 40% is circumstantial, and about only 10% is under our control. So now from all your research, do you think this 10% which is under our control, can that go up? Can it be learned? Happiness, can it be learned or taught? And do you think it's possible that it can even overrule or overcome the genetic bias?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I appreciate that. So the answer is that 10 to 12% is under direct control with these four things. But the key part where it can expand is that your circumstances get better when you have better habits. It's a funny thing. You can affect your own luck. So the 40% that's circumstantial is relationships that are good or bad, or interactions with other people that are good or bad. The better your habits are, the better your luck tends to be. So you can kind of own that 40% as well. There's no evidence that on the genetic side that we can affect that very much. What we can do is accommodate ourselves to our genetic proclivities in a better way. So finding, for example, that you're a melancholic person and understanding that means that you know where your baseline is, and being comfortable with that, being comfortable with yourself is a key thing, and not trying to be as happy as your neighbor all the time. It's funny. It's being comfortable with you turns out to make that 50% that's genetic less important, even though it's not going to change. Does that make sense? Exactly right. And I realize I'm speaking to a trained geneticist, so I say this with real humility. But that's one of the things that I've found, and I think that's the best approach.
Front row.
Thank you. I'm Faizur Rahman. I'm from the Islamic Forum for the Promotion of Moderate Thought. My question is to you. You said that you didn't believe in the indices of happiness. Perhaps would contentment be a better word for that? Contentment.
For what?
For happiness. Suppose if you use the word content.
I see.
Will that be a better word? And number two, you spoke of faith, friendship, and other things. What about people who have no faith in any religion? What about the agnostics or the atheists?
Yeah.
How would you address?
It's an interesting point. So the first one was
would be
contentment. Instead of happiness, contentment. Would be
so this is interesting. There actually are studies that contrast happiness with contentment. And contentment and happiness are different. What you find is, getting back to the Danes, Denmark is an extremely contented place. I mean, contentment is basically satisfaction. Now, I look around this room, and we have entrepreneurs in this room. You're an entrepreneur, right? We talked before. You asked a question before. I'm looking. Yeah. You help. Okay. Entrepreneurs tend to be very happy and not contented at all. They're never satisfied. They're moving from thing to thing. Things are never good enough for an entrepreneur. This is part of the entrepreneurial mindset. Some of you are entrepreneurs. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You're pretty happy about your life, but you're not contented. So for me, I want happiness, and I don't expect contentment, because I will never be contented. I'll never be satisfied. I'll never stop. I can't. It's just not part of who I am. So that's a real difference between those two. Now, the second part of your question is interesting. It's, what about people who don't have faith? What we find is that, when I say faith, you think of a religion. And that's actually not what I mean. Because people who have spirituality outside of traditional religion are just as happy as people like you and me. You're a you're a Muslim, I'm a Christian. I'm a very traditional Christian. I have very orthodox Catholic faith, right? But it turns out that if I had kind of a new age spirituality, as long as I'm thinking about higher order, more transcendental things, as long as I'm not just the material, just the here and now, if I'm occupying my imagination with things that are bigger than me, that winds up being the same thing as well. So think of faith really broadly determined. For most of us, that's in the context of more traditional faith.
Okay, so we're running out of time. I know you have tons of questions, but we're just going to take the lady over there.
And then let's go to a young person.
And then we'll go to this young boy or man over there.
Yeah.
Okay?
Young man.
Yeah. So.
I'm Divya. I'm a housewife. I was just curious. The last few years, you hear of so many reports of young adolescents committing suicide. And it's especially, in my own city, I read almost every day. There's something, and for the flimsiest reasons, you have someone getting jilted and therefore deciding to end their lives, or just flunking an exam. So what's happening to our youngsters? Why are they so depressed? So how are we addressing their happiness quotient? Or
Yeah.
I mean, I think the old people seem to be happier in this country than the young.
Yeah.
So how do you
Hold on
deal
for
with
1
that?
second. Let's take the last one. You take both of them together. This.
That's important. Yeah. Sir.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Akash. I'm a student at IIT Madras, and I also work with the Students for Liberty movement. My question to you, while Mr. Dhume did ask something related to this, I'd be more direct. How do you think free enterprise leads to greater happiness? And how to ensure equality of opportunity in developing countries?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
So suicide. We have a suicide epidemic in the United States among young people as well. Among young people, suicide has increased over the last 10 years by 70%. Almost a doubling of the suicide rate. So the United States is a country of 300 million people. 45,000 people will kill themselves this year. It's unprecedented in American history. And it's mostly young people, although there's also a big spike in suicides for men over 75 in the United States. And part of that is social isolation for older people, which is a big moral dilemma. That's completely avoidable if we have proper morality toward elderly people. Younger people, it's a different problem. That's a case of having improper relationships, I believe, largely having to do with the use of social media. I think that actually social media is harming young people in ways that we talked about this before. We're just barely starting to understand this. But what we find is that new studies are suggesting that more social media use is the #1 predictor in whether or not people kill themselves. Now that's an important thing I have kids. My kids are 20 and 18 and 15. This isn't a big deal. I'm not worried about my kids harming themselves, but even if it's not killing themselves, you have to ask yourself whether or not it's harming their mental health. This is, and again, I don't think there's a law that we have to put in place, but I think that as parents and as responsible citizens, we have to start thinking to ourselves whether or not the free access to these things is actually harming them. I think that social media is turning out to be like dangerous drugs. And in 5 years, we're going to see it this way, and we're going to be cutting down on the use of it, and parents are not going to let their kids be looking at screens before they're 15 and 16 years old, because it permanently changes the brain, leads to more depression and these catastrophic outcomes. How does free enterprise lead to happiness? Indirectly. Anybody who says that capitalism is the source of happiness is incorrect. Remember, the 4 sources that bring you happiness are faith, family, friends, and sanctified ordinary work. What we want is a system that makes these things as possible as we can make them. We want to give people access to these things as much as we possibly can. One of the reasons that people are happier is because they're matched to their jobs in better ways. And one of the best ways that we can do that is to have relatively free labor markets. The reason that freedom matters for this is such that people can earn their success, that people can be needed by the economy. And this is a source of dignity, and that leads to happiness. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that just because there's more or less capitalism, there will be more or less happiness, but it is a great facilitator for that, and that's how we should be thinking about building people's lives in more productive ways by giving them more freedom. Thank you for that. Great question. You have a great future.
Sorry, there are many more questions, but we have to close at 8. It's 8. Thank you very much.
If you are going to make only one point, I don't want this one. Please avoid hurry, worry, curry to get buried.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You are supposed to be born with easiness. Your mind dispels the easiness, the disease comes into that. This unease becomes disease. But
by curry you mean mutton.
Whatever thing, anything which you feel is not suitable.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And with Diwali around the corner and all of us wishing each other cheer and happiness, I think we couldn't have asked for a better topic. So thank you very much, Dr. Brooks and Sadanand, for a very insightful conversation. And thank you all for being with us here today. On behalf of the patrons and board of Chennai International Center, let me extend our warm Diwali wishes to all of you, and hope to see you at our next event on November 24th. It's by historian Vijay Kumar on a very interesting topic of idol theft. Thank you. Have a good night and happy Diwali.